happened. He somehow slipped away. The disciples followed him out of the city, down the hill to Jericho, down across the Jordan River, out into the country. Jesus was supposed to lead Israel to victory. He was supposed to restore their sovereignty, their pride as a nation. He was supposed to bring reforms and restore true worship. But now his popularity seemed to be waning. In the capital city, the religious and political leaders hated him. They were trying to murder him. And so what was Jesus doing? Why is he here now teaching in Perea? It was like they were in exile. The disciples had a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. But as these things were still running through their minds, there in Perea, suddenly a messenger arrived and delivered a message to Jesus. He whom you love is ill. They all knew immediately who that was. It was Lazarus, one of Jesus' best friends. Jesus and the disciples had stayed with them many times. Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha. They too were disciples of Jesus, even though he had never asked them to give up their homes and their jobs and to follow him around. But they loved him and they believed in him and they supported him. It was clear to the 12 that Jesus had a special relationship with the three of them. He visibly relaxed when he walked through the door of their home. He spoke differently. He laughed easily. He seemed comfortable. His words weren't guarded. He didn't speak in parables. He just talked to them simply and plainly. And the three of them just ate it up. They loved him, and he loved them. Their home had become a place where he could get away and recharge after busy days of ministry. No, they hadn't been asked to go out on the road with him and sleep in the wilderness, but they had sacrificed to serve him in other ways. And they would sacrifice even more in the coming days, though they didn't understand that yet. They just knew that Lazarus had suddenly fallen extremely ill. He had been fine, and then it seemed like the next moment he was barely conscious. They were afraid for him. They had seen illness like this before, and usually it didn't end well. When the disciples found Jesus and brought the messenger to him, he was in the middle of something. He stood up when the messenger delivered the news, and they were surprised then by his response. Notice what John tells us in chapter 11, verse 4. It says, "But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it.'" Now, it wasn't what he said that disturbed them. The illness doesn't lead to death, he said. It's for the glory of God. That seemed like great news. But it was the way that he said it. It was almost like it was no big deal to him, like he didn't care about them. If he was concerned or full of sympathy for his suffering friend Lazarus or for the anxiety that Mary and Martha must be going through, he didn't seem to show it. He just sent his response with the messenger and immediately went back to what he was doing. The disciples raised their eyebrows and they looked at each other. They wondered to themselves, what's that about? Shouldn't we go up there to Lazarus? The disciples knew that Jesus loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha, didn't he? But why then did he seem so uninterested? Why didn't he want to go to them right away when he got this news? It was a discrepancy that honestly they couldn't understand. And the fact that that was such a mystery to them really was only natural, but after all, we tend to do the same thing. Because we know that God loves us. He doesn't always act, though, the way that we expect, given his love for us. And so something in our experience doesn't seem to add up in many cases. Either he doesn't love us after all, or maybe he's not able to do what we expect. The fact that we might be confused about what God ought to do as a result of his love for us sometimes gets overlooked in our thinking. The messenger returned to Bethany the same day. Worn out from the long journey and the steep climb back up the hill, he nearly collapsed as he came plodding into town. When Mary and Martha saw him, they were surprised. "Where's Jesus?" But rather than Jesus' presence, the sisters received instead Jesus' message of hope. The illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, the sisters were surprised that Jesus didn't come. They knew that he would have healed Lazarus. Of course he would, if he had come. But at least the message is good. It'll be okay, they thought. Jesus didn't come, but he knows what will happen. The message is good, they told each other. Lazarus will recover. But still, they were afraid. They were anxious for their brother. The fever seemed worse now. He wasn't moving that much anymore. He was nearly unconscious. And when he did wake up, it was only to groan in pain and discomfort. When will the fever break, they wonder? When will he start to recover? It was almost unbearable. And then everything crashed down around them. They watched as their brother's breathing slowed. His breathing became a shallow, raspy sound. The color left his face. And then he was gone. For a moment, an intense panic struck them as they saw him go still. Then panic gave way to pure grief, which overtook them both. All of reality seemed to disappear into the screams of wailing and sobbing. Jesus was in Perea, and Lazarus was dead. They couldn't believe it. This can't be happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. Word went out from the house, and soon friends and neighbors and relatives began to gather from Bethany, from the other nearby villages, also from Jerusalem, only a couple miles away. The two sisters found themselves spinning in a whirlwind of confusion. Questions and emotions crashed over them, one after another in endless waves. Why? And what are we going to do now? And where is Jesus? And why didn't he come? Doesn't he care? He said this wouldn't happen. The grief would swell up into anger and then down into disappointment, and it would all come back up into confusion and then back to just plain painful grief. Lazarus was dead, their brother and their friend, their supporter. He was dead, and they were left without him. The professional mourners came and joined the already large group now of family and friends. And with great emotion and loud wailing, they brought Lazarus' body to the cave. They laid down his prepared body, wrapped in cloths. Before the sun had set on the same day, the stone was rolled in front of the entrance, and he was gone. As Jesus lay down to sleep that night, not the news that Lazarus was sick. Jesus could have healed him right away. But Jesus had told them that Lazarus would get better, and so they had stayed in Perea to continue their ministry there. But now, after waiting for days, you want to go to Judea? Just a few days ago, you were nearly murdered by the leaders in Jerusalem. Surely it's not safe to return. And if Lazarus is going to recover, why would we go now at this point? Notice what John tells us in chapter 11, beginning with verse 8. It says, "The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him.'" In other words, Jesus was telling them, I have a certain amount of time here to do my work. When my time is up, then it's up, but not before. And as long as I'm following the Father's plan, I will not stumble. He will not permit anything to happen to me outside of that plan. But if I go and I do my own thing, if I wander off on my own and depart from my Father's will, then I will stumble. I can only succeed if I'm doing what my Father directs, and I can only fail if I go my own way. In verse 11 it says that after saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. And for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." The disciples were shocked to hear Jesus say that Lazarus had died. "What happened? I thought you said that he wasn't going to die. Why didn't we go to him then? If the disciples were confused before, now their heads were spinning. Nothing was making sense to them. Not that that was anything new, really. Many times they hadn't understood why Jesus did what he did, but they had learned over time through practice that Jesus was trustworthy. They usually understood afterward. He'd come through for them time and again. But now Lazarus was dead. Lazarus was their friend too, and this news pained them to hear. Some of them looked around as the weight of what Jesus had just said began to sink in. Here they were in Aenon, the place where John the Baptist had been baptizing, by the way. They remembered how things went for John. 2 of the 12 had been disciples of John's before they began to follow Jesus. Their former master had been arrested and left to languish in prison. Surely Jesus could have freed him. He could have eased his suffering. But for some reason he didn't. And then John had been put to death by Herod. The Pharisees, of course, hadn't failed to ask the disciples about that. Why did your master let John die in prison, they'd asked, sort of as though they really wanted an answer to that question. But the disciples had been left speechless anyway. They had no answer to any of these questions. For your sake, Jesus had said. What did that mean? None of them seemed to know. And why did Jesus say that Lazarus was sleeping when Lazarus was dead? The disciples' minds were clouded and confused. Jesus' words and their own questions were all muddled inside, along with their feelings of disappointment that they'd experienced when their master was rejected in Jerusalem. In verse 16 it says, "So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us go also, that we may die with him.'" The disciples didn't understand what was happening, and yet, in spite of their confusion, they threw their lot in with their master. They followed him now simply because he was theirs and they were his. Thomas really only said what everyone else was thinking. If he goes back, he's going to die. So we might as well go die with him. And they were right that Jesus would die in Judea. But they didn't know that before they would see Jesus as the Lamb that was slain, they would first see him as the resurrection and the life. And so up the hill they climbed, some 20 miles to Bethany, more than 3,000 feet of elevation gain from 1,200 feet below sea level, just north of the Dead Sea there. Finally, they came to Bethany, the small town just outside of Jerusalem. Jesus arrived at the edge of town, and as the rest of the disciples caught up and the group gathered together, they understood why Jesus didn't go into town. Even from outside of town where they were, they could hear the wailing of the mourners. It was customary, of course. But they knew that Jesus wasn't excited about a big show. Paid mourners who would wail and cry and play instruments, they weren't really mourning. They weren't themselves stricken with grief over this man's death. But in the ancient Jewish society of the Near East, it would be an embarrassment if you didn't have a bunch of people who were so heartbroken over your death that no one was loudly crying and wailing for days and days. And so it became customary to hire professional wailers who would come and cry at your funeral for you. But Jesus wasn't excited about all of that show. He just wanted to be with his friends. He wanted to talk privately with them, and the presence of a big crowd, of course, would make that difficult. So when they came to the edge of the town, a man was passing by, and Jesus asked him, "How long ago was Lazarus buried?" "It's been 4 days," the man said. 4 days. There was no doubt then. It was customary to check the tomb regularly during the first 3 days, in case the person wasn't really dead or somehow they revived a few days after they were thought dead. Some of the rabbis taught that a person's spirit would hang around their body for 3 days in case the opportunity came when they could re-enter the person, but by the 4th day, the spirit would call it quits and leave the area, apparently. But at this point, there was no room for doubt in anyone's mind that Lazarus was, in fact, truly and irrevocably dead. Jesus found a spot to rest, and he asked the passerby to tell Mary and Martha that he had arrived. The disciples weren't sure how to feel or what to do, and so they found a comfortable spot and they sat down together with Jesus. After a few moments, Martha came running out of the town. She saw Jesus and she ran up to him. The disciples could see the love and the pain and the disappointment even in the way that she looked at Jesus. In verse 21, it says that Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who is coming into the world." Martha was so disappointed. "If you had been here," she said. She was so heartbroken about her brother's death, but she was also heartbroken about Jesus. She couldn't understand why he hadn't come. It was a severe test of her faith, but still she trusted him. She looked up into his face and she said those words, and as she spoke, she could see his love for her and her brother. She knew that Jesus was the Messiah, that he had come from God. She didn't know why he had allowed Lazarus to die. Even now, though, she hoped that he might still be able to do something. She hoped, and yet she was afraid to hope. "I am the resurrection and the life," Jesus told her. "The resurrection on the last day that you're referring to, yeah, that's me. The power to live even right now, that power is mine," he was telling her. And as Jesus comforted her, he directed her not only to the hope of a resurrection, but also to put her hope in him. To hope in him in spite of the disappointment and the grief that she now felt. To trust him in spite of the fact that she didn't understand why he waited, why he allowed Lazarus to die when he could have come and healed him. And she followed his lead. She submitted herself to him with those words, unequaled in the Gospels. "Yes, Lord, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God who is coming into the world." Nowhere else in the Gospels is there another confession of faith in Jesus so clear, or from a person with so much reason to shut her heart. Peter's confession was made hastily and then quickly forgotten as soon as his faith was tested. But Martha endured a great test of her faith, and when she chose to surrender herself to Jesus with that confession of her trust, in spite of the enormous unanswered questions and grief she was experiencing, she put everything on the line with Jesus. And her faith was soon to be rewarded. In verse 28, it says that when she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." As Mary had been sitting in the house in mourning, she had been unaware of Jesus' arrival because of all the commotion going on in the house. But when Martha told her, she jumped up immediately and she went out to Jesus. She too was confused by her feelings, and as she approached Jesus, this new wave of emotion came over her and she fell down at his feet. "If only you had been here, Lord. If only you had been here." But before she could say any more to Jesus, the crowd of mourners who had followed her out of the house gathered around, interrupting the conversation, and she held back the rest of the questions and then fell silent there on the ground. And Jesus looked over this scene with Mary there and all of these mourners around, his dear friend weeping, experiencing so much pain and disappointment, now surrounded by relatives and friends from Jerusalem. And some of those people were hurting alongside her, but some of them were not. Jesus could see that some of them were only there under false pretenses. They were actually Jesus' enemies, and they were there to undermine him. And although they made a show of mourning now, soon they would be plotting Jesus' death. In verse 33, it says that when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. He was moved emotionally with sympathy for his friends as they experienced this pain. Jesus' heart was breaking as well because of his deep love for them. But the disciples, observing this scene, noticed something else going on. They could see in his expression and hear in his voice a great displeasure. John describes Jesus as being violently displeased. The translation that we have here, greatly troubled, hardly does justice to the harsh expression that John uses here in the story. And yet, because of Mary and the others who were truly suffering, because of their pain, Jesus restrained himself. In verse 34, it says, "And he said, 'Where have you laid him?' And they said to him, 'Lord, come and see.' Mary stood up, the crowd turned, began walking and wailing as they led Jesus and Mary back to the tomb. As Jesus began to walk next to Mary toward the tomb, he was overcome with emotion in that moment. He felt fully the pain and the heartache of his friends, and he was drawn for a moment to consider the pain and brokenness that would come to them in the future as well. Ever since Satan brought sin into the world, suffering has accompanied it. And in verse 35, it says simply that Jesus wept. Or rather, he burst into tears. His heart was breaking, and he began to sob as he walked along with Mary. Jesus wasn't crying for Lazarus. He knew what he was about to do, but he wept for his friends. When Mary had come up to Jesus and she had fallen down in front of him, she had been overcome with her own emotion, and she hadn't understood how Jesus had felt. But now, as she walked with him and she saw him crying in sympathy with her, she realized the extent of his love, the extent of his identification with her suffering, and the deepest questions in her heart were answered. It wasn't what she would see when they arrived at the tomb that would be the answer to those questions. Rather, it was what she saw on the way to the tomb. She knew in her heart that Jesus had not abandoned them. It seemed like he hadn't come in time. It seemed like he had abandoned her, like he had abandoned Martha, like he had abandoned Lazarus. But as she saw the tears streaming down his face and she felt his body shake as she put her arm around him, her heart opened to his, and all of those other questions seemed less important. She knew that he was the Son of God, and she knew that he loved her. And when everything else was boiled down, that was the truth that remained, and that was enough. Others in the crowd looked on and they saw how Jesus wept, but they didn't understand like Mary did. In verse 36 it says, "So the Jews said, 'See how he loved him.' But some of them said, 'Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?' As the large group was drawing near to the tomb, they saw Jesus crying. They thought that Jesus too was mourning the loss of his friend, but some were there to play the skeptic. Couldn't he have kept him from dying? Where was he when his friend was sick?" And in verse 38, it goes on, it says, "Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, 'Take away the stone.' Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, 'Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days.'" Martha, always the pragmatist. When Jesus said, "Take away the stone," she thought that he wanted to mourn over Lazarus. She saw the tears on his cheeks. She saw his red eyes. She heard his voice catch as he spoke. Of course, he wanted to see his friend's body, to weep over him, to grieve like they had been able to. But it's been 4 days now. Did he realize it had been so long since her brother had died? The smell of a dead body would be strong by now. Even now, Martha didn't realize what was going to happen. What she had hoped for seemed too implausible, too impossible. On the one hand, she had seen some of Jesus' amazing works. She knew that whatever Jesus asked the Father happened. But the time for a miracle was days ago, before all of this. Yes, Jesus had raised a little girl from death, but that was only hours after she had died. Maybe she hadn't even really died at all. Martha wasn't really sure. This was different. Lazarus had been dead 4 days. That's a long time. But Martha's protest was short-lived in that moment. In verse 40 it says, Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." As the massive round stone was rolled away from the opening to the cave, just a small, low doorway, no more than a couple feet high, light began to flood into this darkened tomb. Everyone watched with anticipation. They barely had time to wonder what Jesus meant when he told Martha that she would see the glory of God. As Jesus began to pray, all eyes turned and were fixed on him. "I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." It's so like Jesus, so at one with the Father, and also so concerned for the people who were around. Jesus was the centerpiece of this massive crisis of faith. All of these questions that people had were about him. Did he care about his friend? Was he able to help him? Was he actually sent from God, or was he a liar? Mere days ago, Jesus' own people had picked up stones to kill him, and he had had to leave the country or his mission would be cut short before the right time. And in only a few more days, Jesus would be the one lying in a tomb. But before he was rejected, he wanted to give people one more evidence, one more chance for people to really believe. Because he loved them. He loved the Pharisees and the scribes. He loved the gawkers and the curious. He loved the rich and the poor. He loved the powerful and the weak. He loved his disciples, and he loved Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. And he knew that they were confused. But he never scolded his friends' misunderstanding. He never criticized their questions. Patiently, he drew them to put their trust in him, the light of the world, the Word of God, the way, the truth, the resurrection, and the life. In verse 43, it says, "When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come out!' A hush had fallen over the crowd. As he had lifted his face to heaven, silence had come over them. Every eye was on him. Now his voice rang out with a kind of power that no one had ever felt before. It was more than the voice of a man. It was more than the command of the most respected general at the start of a battle. It rang loudly in their ears, and it shook them as though stirring up something inside of them they didn't know existed, as though there were some sixth sense inside of them that they had never understood before, simply because it had never had anything to sense before. As they heard his voice and they felt the power of his words, it seemed to them as though Jesus himself were different, larger, brighter, as though he filled more space or in some way was more real or more powerful than they had ever imagined. They heard, in fact, the voice of the archangel. The voice that they will hear again one day, whether sooner or later. The voice that will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the trumpet of God, the voice of the archangel. They heard that voice for the first time merely as a preview of what is to come. And after a moment of just looking at Jesus, suddenly everyone's eyes turned to follow his. The cave there in the rocks on the side of the hill, the dark opening that seemed to just swallow up any light that entered into it. They stood motionless and silent in anticipation. Suddenly, the opening of the tomb grew bright. There was something at the entrance now reflecting the light from the sun, where moments before there had been only darkness. In verse 44, it says, "The man who had died came out, with his hands and feet bound with linen strips and his face wrapped with a cloth, Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Friends, there are always questions with God. There are always things that we don't understand. The disciples didn't understand. Mary and Martha didn't understand. There were things that they couldn't understand. Jesus didn't tell them every single thing. He didn't show them all of his plans. He didn't show them why he did everything that he did. But what he did show them was himself. And because they knew him, because they loved him, because they had him, they could wait for the resurrection. They waited for the resurrection, and their faith was not in vain. It was not for no purpose. Because they had Jesus, they waited for the resurrection, and their faith was rewarded. Friends, you and I don't understand everything either. We don't have the answers to all of our questions. Many of those answers probably are just not even available to us right now. But what is available to us right now is Jesus. I know you don't have answers to all of your questions, but Jesus is available to you. And so put your faith in him. Trust him with the things that you don't know yet, that don't make sense right now. Wait for him. Wait for the day when he is fully revealed with the shout of command, with the trumpet of God. He will appear in the clouds surrounded by a glorious army of angels. Wait patiently, friends, for his appearing. And your faith will not be in vain. The praise team is going to come forward now, and I invite you to join us as we sing our closing song and stand with us as we sing. And as we sing this song, I want to invite you to use this as an opportunity to put your trust in Jesus today. Make that choice to trust him. Put your faith in him and tell him that you trust him as we sing this song together and as we look forward to the final fulfillment of his reign, the resurrection and the life. As we look forward to being with him in heaven, make that choice and use this opportunity to tell him.
Please stand for our closing hymn, number 633, When We All Get to Heaven. Number 633.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of him in glory will the toils of life repay. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon His beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory.
Are you looking forward to that day? Me too. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we put our trust in you, waiting patiently for you, looking forward to the resurrection that we know is coming. Lord, you've given us so much reason to trust you. You've shown us who you are, your character of love and compassion, your character of forgiveness. You've shown us in the Scriptures a vision of your power and your ability to give life. And Lord, many of us have lost loved ones along the way. Before you come, many of us may fall asleep as well. But we live and we continue on day by day with faith that you will give us life again. We put our trust in you and we love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Church, may God bless you on the Sabbath afternoon. Join us for potluck downstairs, and I hope to see you tonight at 7 out at the Academy in the gym. It's going to be a good time.